check out my cool new pistol. It is in 9mm. Thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and yeah, saying 9mm doesn't really give you all the information you necessarily need because we actually have like a dozen different 9mm cartridges. So I figured today, let's take a brief look at where the main one, 9mm Parabellum, came from and what all of the other old 9mm cartridges are, how they differ for each other, and what they were intended for. So let me start off by saying there are a couple things I'm not going to cover. One of them is 9mm Glisenti because, frankly, I still want to do a bunch more research on that and make sure that I'm got all the right details on it before I talk about it on camera. The second one is 38 Auto, because if I get into all of the 38 caliber cartridges as well, which are technically the same size as 9mm, but that becomes an even deeper rabbit hole that's a bit much for one video. Suffice to say, 38 automatic, 38 ACP was really the first cartridge in this progression if we look at ones that are specifically 9mm in diameter. But we're going to ignore it because 38 ACP is essentially a dead cartridge today. And instead, we're going to start by taking a look at 9mm Parabellum. Sort of. Our story actually begins with the Luger, but not the 9mm Luger. It begins with the 7.65mm Luger. That is the original cartridge that DWM and Georg Luger developed for this pistol. It's a bottlenecked round, which was common in early automatic pistol cartridges as a way to ensure good gas seal of the cartridge in the chamber. And it really is a very good cartridge. It was actually used by many different militaries. However, when DWM started shopping the Luger around for potential military contracts, one of the pieces of feedback they got was a number of countries would really like a bigger bullet. 9mm was kind of well known from revolver days and muzzleloading days. It is dimensionally essentially the same as 38 caliber. Lots of people had 38 caliber revolvers, and they just thought bigger bullet would be a little better. And so DWM adapted, and they developed the 9mm Parabellum cartridge. So on top we have 7.65 Parabellum, on bottom we have 9 Parabellum. Essentially what they did was just keep the exact same case head, but blow the body of the cartridge case out to be almost a straight wall, which gives you 9mm at the tip. It's worth pointing out 7.65 was actually a 21mm long case. When they make it bigger, when they make it larger in diameter, because the bullet gets larger in diameter, in order to maintain proper ballistic shape, it also gets longer. And so you end up needing to shorten the 9mm case in order to keep the cartridge fitting in the same overall length as the 7.65. And this was very important to DWM and the Luger pistol, because the idea was you could get the Luger in either one of these cartridges and every single part except the barrel was interchangeable. The 7.65 and 9mm Lugers use the same bolt face, the same magazine, everything except the barrel. So in order to make that happen, we went from 7.65 by 21mm down to 9 by 19mm. Add in the longer 9mm bullet, and you get the same overall length between the two cartridges. And so that is our 9mm Parabellum cartridge. This is the most common thing people are referring to if they just say 9mm. It's far from the only one, and in fact there are some problems even within this exact cartridge. There are many different loadings, different bullet weights, different powder charges and such that are used all within the general umbrella of 9mm Parabellum. So for example, what we have here, and this is actually French ammunition, for PA is automatic pistol and PM is submachine gun. So this is a loading that is safe to use in both pistols and submachine guns. However, you'll also find some that was manufactured with a much hotter powder charge that is only safe to use in submachine guns, like this IMI Israeli ammunition. You load this into a pistol and you're likely to damage it. And beyond that, we have a wide variety of other loadings and characteristics of this ammunition. So first off, it's sometimes called 9mm Luger because of the Luger pistol that it is intrinsically tied to. You'll also find it, of course, 9 by 19, which is its metric dimensions. You will sometimes find it as 9mm Para, just shortened Parabellum. You'll also sometimes see it as 9mm NATO, because it was adopted by NATO. You'll notice here we have a 124 grain bullet. Here we have a subsonic loading with a 150 grain bullet. There are 147 grain loadings out there. This is a 115. This is Full Metal Jacket. This is also Full Metal Jacket, although it doesn't say it on there. You will also find it in jacketed hollow point loadings. There's just a ton of variety among 9mm Parabellum. So let's leave that as it is and move on to some of the other cartridges. 9mm Parabellum was introduced in 1902. The first country to actually adopt it was the German Navy in 1904, but the cartridge was in 1902. Only a year later, in 1903, we have the next of the common military 9mm pistol cartridges, and that is one cartridge that is called both 9mm Bergmann and 9mm Largo, also sometimes 9mm Bergmann Bayard. And that is this guy. It is a 23mm long case, and you can see a pretty striking size difference there between 9x19, 9 Parabellum, and 9x23, or in this case, 9mm Bergmann on the bottom. Now, it is named for the Bergmann pistols, originally the 1903 Bergmann Mars, which was adopted by the Spanish. In Spanish service, this became known as the 9mm long cartridge, or 9mm Largo, to differentiate it from the other common 9mm, the 9mm Parabellum. Now, one would expect that the 9mm Largo here is going to be a more powerful cartridge than Parabellum because it's physically larger. It's almost 20% longer. However, it was actually loaded a bit lighter. And the two cartridges are, in fact, almost exactly the same in ballistic performance. And this is largely what would lead to the 9mm Largo dying out. It simply didn't really have anything better to offer than 9mm Parabellum. And it was in a physically larger case. So it would take some time for that to happen. There would be a bunch of Spanish pistols in 9mm Largo as well as the Danish guns, but within a few decades, 9 Largo would kind of fade away. At almost the exact same time that Bergmann was bringing out the 9mm Largo, John Browning and FN were bringing out their own 9mm cartridge, and this would be the 9mm Browning Long. It was originally offered primarily in the FN model of 1903, which didn't actually go into production until 1907. And a few other pistols. The French used it in the Le Français pistol, and there were a few other guns. The Swedish used it in a submachine gun, but this is a particularly uncommon cartridge to find in use. A grand total of less than 50,000 of these pistols were ever made. Now, if we go back to our comparison of the 9x19 on top, 9x20 Browning is 1mm longer. It is a 9x20mm case, and it is a semi-rimmed case, which means the rim of the cartridge down here is actually slightly larger in diameter than the body of the case. 9mm Parabellum and most of our modern cartridges are rimless, which means that the base and the rim are the exact same diameter. Now, the reason that this was done, and John Browning did this on several of his cartridges, the 25 ACP, 32 ACP, and 9mm, it's not really 9 ACP, but it is 9mm Browning, all have this semi-rimmed style of case. And that was done to simplify head spacing, where a rimless case has to use the shoulder or the neck of the cartridge case as the data point to determine how deep to set the cartridge. A semi-rimmed case can actually use that extended rim diameter to set the depth, and it makes things a bit simpler. It's a trade-off between a fully rimmed cartridge, like say 38 Special, where the rim is a really good data point for head spacing. However, those rims are large enough to become a problem for feeding in magazines. Well, with the semi-rimmed cases, the rim is small enough in diameter that it doesn't present any fundamental problems in magazines, but it's large enough to actually be useful. This is a trade-off that would be used for a brief time and exists today only really as a holdover on, well, John Browning's two other cartridges that were so popular that they're still in service, those being 25 ACP and 32 ACP. In terms of ballistic power, 9mm Browning is actually a little bit less powerful than 9 Parabellum. We're looking at about a 110 grain bullet at just over 1,000 feet per second. And the reason for this was the cartridge was designed for a pistol that was simple blowback. And if you get much more powerful than this, if you get up to 9mm Parabellum, you're getting to the point that you either have to have a locking system on the gun or you need a particularly heavy slide to deal with all the recoil. To deal with all the energy, to keep the chamber sealed long enough for the pressure to drop so the gun doesn't explode and rupture cases when you fire. So 9 Browning long was just under that threshold, and as it turned out, most militaries would just decide to go with locked breech pistols, and they could get a little bit more powerful cartridge, namely 9x19, without having any problems. We're going to move forward now to 1908, when John Browning goes and invents yet another cartridge that would become phenomenally popular and long-lived, that being the .380 automatic, or as it is typically known in Europe, the 9mm Kurz, or 9mm short, or 9mm corto. All these are names for 9mm short. In terms of actual metric measurements, it is 9x17mm, so it is the shortest and weakest of all our cartridges so far. Now, Browning originally developed this as a cartridge for his model 1903 pocket hammerless, and if that pistol looks an awful lot like FN's model of 1907 here, or FN's 1903, adopted, this is a Swedish 1907 pattern gun, it's because these are based on the exact same patents, and they're basically the same gun. They're both internal hammer, simple blowback pistols. Well, FN figured it'd be a good thing to market as a military pistol, scaled up. Colt in the United States thought it'd be a better gun to market as a civilian pistol for the pocket, scaled down. It was originally introduced in .32 ACP, another of John Browning's cartridges, and in 1908 he develops the 9mm short to give it a bigger size for those who wanted it. In terms of current availability and use, the 9 short, aka .380 auto, is definitely the second most common of the cartridges we're going to look at, behind 9mm Parabellum. So looking at this, you can see it is definitely significantly shorter than 9x19. It's in fact 2mm shorter. It is also unequivocally less powerful. This is approximately a 95 grain bullet traveling at about 950 feet per second. So it's actually not that much less powerful than the 9x20 Browning long, but this is very much a cartridge for a smaller, simple blowback pocket style of pistol, and that's where it continues to be used today. The very same year as John Browning was introducing the Browning short cartridge, Mauser was going the other direction, and they were introducing a particularly powerful cartridge, this being the 9x25mm or 9mm Mauser Export. Note that this is not the same as the current 9x25 Dillon, which is basically just a Wildcat cartridge. 9mm Mauser Export was an attempt to get a yet more powerful cartridge for some of Mauser's export pistol. It was put primarily in the C96 Mauser, which I have some video of here. Unfortunately, I don't have a sample of this ammunition to show you. The cartridge was also used in a couple of early SIG submachine guns in the 1930s. Ultimately, it was really too powerful. It created a lot of recoil. It was much better as a submachine gun cartridge than it was as a handgun cartridge. In handguns, it was just too much recoil, and it was frankly, a relatively large, physically long cartridge that was uncomfortable to fit in pistol grips. It, as I said, made a good submachine gun cartridge, but there weren't enough people who were looking for a submachine gun with different ammunition than their standard handguns, and so the 9x25 died out really quite quickly. Frankly, it had already died out as a pistol cartridge before SIG brought it back in submachine guns. The Hungarians would go ahead and use it, and they would be really the only other country, besides Switzerland, to manufacture anything in 9x25 Mauser. Now we can jump forward to 1912, and we get one of the more confusing and misunderstood cartridges in this whole batch, and that is 9mm Steyr. This was developed specifically for the Steyr Hahn pistol, or Steyr model of 1912 pistol, and it is almost indistinguishable from 9mm Largo. These two cartridges, and by the way, this is Steyr on top and Largo on the bottom, these are not actually the same cartridge. That's the first mistake some people make, is assume that they are, in fact, identical. They're not. However, the tolerance dimensions for 9mm Steyr can almost completely fit within the tolerances of 9mm Bergmann, or 9mm Largo. And so the two are almost essentially interchangeable, although they were not developed to be the same. And really, you should use the appropriate ammunition in the appropriate gun if you're going to shoot one or both of these. In terms of a practical difference, they really have essentially the same ballistics. The difference that you will see is that the Bergmann cartridge was typically used with 125 to 136 grain bullet, where the Steyr cartridge was typically used with about a 115 grain bullet. And you can actually see that here. You can see that the top, the 9mm Steyr, has a slightly smaller bullet. Notice how it's a little less bulged out at the top, where the 9mm Bergmann, or Largo, has a slightly heavier bullet. That's it. These two are extremely similar cartridges, and frankly, the 9mm Steyr didn't survive that much longer than the 9mm Bergmann. The two of them did exactly the same thing. Neither of them did anything that the 9mm Parabellum there couldn't do, and couldn't in fact do better. And so once the initial military use of their original firearms fell away and newer, better pistols were adopted, this cartridge, as well as the Bergmann, kind of fell out of use. So that's it for our original early 9mm cartridges. We have Parabellum, Bergmann, Browning Long, Browning Short, and Steyr. However, there are two more that I do want to touch on that came a few years later. First up, we have the 9mm Ultra, or 9mm Police. This is 9 by 18 millimeters, and I know there are some of you out there who are thinking, aha, 9 by 18, that's the Makarov cartridge. Well, it is, and also it's not. There are two 9 by 18 millimeter cartridges. This is actually the first one. Now, this is a version that was made in the 1970s. The original 9 by 18 Ultra was developed as an experimental project for the Luftwaffe, which was once again an attempt to get just a little bit more power out of a cartridge, a 9mm cartridge, without needing a locked breech action. So the Luftwaffe wanted a more powerful small pistol for its pilots and air crews, and essentially they wanted to just chamber a bigger or a hotter cartridge in the Walther PP or PPK pistol. And so Walther developed the 9 by 18 Ultra. Now, ultimately, they found it to be a little too powerful for this. It damaged the pistols. It would tend to crack slides and parts over a relatively short time frame. And so they ended up pursuing development of a rotating barrel, sort of locked breech pistol to use it. The whole project ended up going nowhere, but the outcome was the creation of this 9 by 18 millimeter cartridge. Ballistically, it was approximately a 100 grain bullet traveling at about 1,060 feet per second. So it is a bit more powerful than 380, still less powerful than 9 Parabellum. Again, pretty close to on par with the 9mm Browning Long, but in a much smaller package. So in the 1930s, this whole project went to nothing. However, it was brought back in the early 1970s when it was chambered for a couple pistols, essentially to do the exact same thing. Walther brought back essentially the PP in 9mm Ultra. It was also used by SIG in one of their pistols. I believe there was an Astra that was chambered for it. There were 3 or 4 or 5 handguns in the 1970s that were put together for this cartridge. Ultimately, none of them were successful, and the cartridge died off a second time. Last but not least here, we have the 9mm Makarov. This was developed in 1946. The Makarov pistol itself was put into production starting in 1951, and this was a Soviet development that is more or less unrelated to the rest of these pistols. The Soviet Union wanted to replace the Tokarev pistol with an officer's sidearm that would be smaller and lighter, and they didn't have any particularly significant needs for cartridge power. They weren't going to use this in a submachine gun. They were using the Kalashnikov as their effective submachine gun, so they weren't trying to share pistol and submachine gun ammunition. Instead, they wanted something that would be lightweight, something that would make for a relatively inexpensive and simple handgun, and so they specifically wanted something that was simple blowback, and the Makarov does that. They also wanted 9mm because they figured that a lower velocity, larger bullet, 9mm Makarov, would essentially have the same terminal performance as a smaller but higher velocity bullet, say the 7.62 Tokarev cartridge. So this was designed to fit in that space, and as such, it's actually fairly similar to the 9mm Ultra, the 9mm Browning Long, and the 380 ACP. It's a little more powerful than 380. It stands apart from the rest of these cartridges specifically in that it is actually a 9.2 millimeter bullet. All of the other cartridges we've looked at are essentially 0.355 inch in diameter projectiles. The 9mm Makarov is 0.364, so it cannot use the same projectiles as all of these other cartridges. And I'm a little bit hesitant to say this, but it appears to be true. I'm a little concerned because sounds an awful lot like some of the sort of FUD lore stories that we've heard about things like 7.62 by 54 and 7.62 NATO. The Russians, or the Soviets, specifically chose a non-standard bullet diameter, apparently to actually prevent use of captured ammunition by enemy forces. They weren't trying to make anything else fit in the Makarov, they just wanted to deny use of their own captured ammunition to anyone else they might be fighting who presumably wouldn't also be using firearms chambered for 9mm Makarov. They may have had some bad experiences in the past with, say, Finland using a lot of their own supplies against them in the Winter War and the Continuation War, and wanted to avoid that. At this point, I'm getting a bit speculative here, but the absolute fact of the matter is 9mm Makarov is not the same 9mm as all of the others that we've looked at today. So ballistically, it falls pretty well in between these two cartridges. This is 9x17 or 380, 9x18 Makarov, and 9x19 Parabellum, and it pretty well splits the difference between those. You'll note that I have a steel-cased cartridge here. Steel case can be used for any of these cartridges, as can brass. This just happens to be what I have available myself. That is quite a lot of 9mm, but we're not quite done yet. There are a couple more that I want to touch on that I don't have physical examples of, so we'll just go through them fairly quickly here. The first is 9x21. This is a cartridge that was developed in the mid-1980s entirely for legal reasons. There were a number of countries around at the time, and there still are a few. Mexico is one example, Italy, France at the time, although not any longer. Countries where civilian possession or use of quote-unquote military cartridges was prohibited. So 9mm Parabellum was not allowed in civilian usage because it was a military cartridge. These laws are typically put in place to prevent theft or pilfering of ammunition from military stores, or to prevent the use of stolen military arms. It's really not a good solution to anything, but it's been done by a number of countries. And so what came about to circumvent this was the 9x21. 9x21mm is exactly the same case as 9x19, but the case is 2mm longer and the bullet is seated 2mm deeper into it. So the overall length is identical, the ballistics are identical, and it is simply a way to be able to offer the same pistol on the commercial market in countries like Italy in 9mm that being offered in 9 Parabellum everywhere else. So you will see a lot of the modern commercially, like the competition pistols that are of interest to people, guns like CZ75s, for example, being offered in 9x21 in Italy and previously in France, where they're offered in 9x19 everywhere else. So that's one of them. That's the whole reason for the existence of that cartridge. We also then have, from the late 1980s, we have 9mm Winchester Magnum, which was developed specifically for the Automag pistols. It really went nowhere else. It was just, we have the 44 caliber Automags and we want something that's a little bit smaller in diameter, but just as ridiculously powerful. 9mm Winchester Magnum. We have 9x25 Dillon. This is the same overall length as that early Mauser export cartridge, but in this case, this is a Wildcat setup, again, to pretty much just be a massively overpowered 9mm cartridge. It's never gotten into any sort of commercial level of production at all. And lastly, introduced in 1996, we have 9x23 Winchester. This was a cartridge that was really developed specifically for IPSC, that is the International Practical Shooting Confederation, and it was a way to try and get a 9mm diameter cartridge that had enough power to qualify as a major caliber cartridge without losing the capacity that you would need to do if you bumped to a 40 or 45 caliber cartridge. So 9mm is small in diameter, and then allows you to have a large magazine capacity while also getting all the points for shooting major caliber. It got a little bit of traction in the IPSC world. I don't think it really has much these days anymore. It's been surpassed by some other things. That actually did hit production, but it's still a very niche cartridge. So that is pretty much all of the 9mm cartridges that are out there. I think we definitely touched on all the relevant historical ones and also all the ones that you might actually find at a store today. So if you are wondering where all these things came from and why there's such a variety, hopefully this has been a little bit enlightening. Thanks for watching.